Sure. Thank you, Pastor Jen, and welcome, David or Pastor David. We're glad you're here. I don't really, I'm not concerned with numbers. I just, in fact, the smaller the group, the better. So, I have slides, but it's not intended to be formal or anything like that. So please interject, and I think that would make the conversation more lively and fruitful for all of us. I think as far as my bio, the important aspects are Asian American, I'm Korean American, I'm a person of faith. I grew up in the church. And as a physician, I sort of stumbled upon this topic of childhood trauma and how it affects our health about 8 years ago. This is after all of my medical school training. I was almost done with residency, and I stumbled upon this topic, and I just knew that it was the elephant in the room. And it's sort of the combination of all of those things that um, really is what I'm going to be talking about today. And hopefully, I love the church. I love the Asian American church, especially. It's where I grew up. It's such a meaningful institution for me, and it still is. But I realize it's not perfect, far from it. And there's a lot of things that we have yet to unpack collectively. And so I'm hoping that whatever I share today can help sort of drive that process along. Uh, Pastor Jen, I wonder if you could you have to give me some privileges. There we go. Okay. All right. So hopefully you're seeing mountains there. This is a photo I took actually of Breckenridge, Colorado. Okay. So I think I've titled this presentation, I was playing around with the idea of shalom, this idea of reweaving, re-knitting together uh, aspects of our lives, both internally, interpersonally, in a community as God intended it. And I think a big part of what is missing or may have been missing for a while in the Asian American church is understanding our stories. And I know that sounds really generic and broad, so I'll get more specific with that. But growing up in Atlanta, we really weren't concerned about where we came from as Koreans, why we were in Atlanta, why we settled in Atlanta. Um, and I think our agnosticism to our past contributed to a lot of I think dysfunction that we're still encountering today. Um, this is my preface slide to say that I don't I really am just honored to be here and not coming to you as someone who has worked it all out, but alongside you all on this journey. And I like this slide because it sort of illustrates that we all have a path that we're walking on, and at some points we might converge on someone else's path that has been sort of trailblazed before us, and that makes our journey a little bit lighter, and I hope that I can offer some of that today. I think I like this slide because it stands in contrast to the image that we tend to have in life, in terms of we're all climbing this mountain and the goal is to get to the top. And when you see someone ahead of you on that mountain, you want to grab their heel, or you feel someone's heel grabbing you from below. And it's like this competition. But I like the image of that we're all kind of in this open field on a journey together, and we can learn from each other in that way. Uh, this presentation is really built off one of the most well-known verses in the Bible. I'm sure you all know it. You've probably preached on it many times or read it several times in your journey. It says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength." The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. And that's from Mark 12:30 through 31. And so you can see I added some emphasis on the line, love your neighbor as yourself. For most of my life, my interpretation of that part went something like, love your neighbor. Okay, I can do that. Challenge accepted. And then that latter part, as yourself or as myself, whatever, right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. And what I wish to submit to us here is that I believe there is an endemic in the Asian American church of really neglecting that latter part. We, I'm not sure we really know how to love ourselves in the way that God intends, because in a lot of our churches, we don't have a healthy view of ourselves and we don't have a healthy view of who we are in God's eyes. In my experience, we've never really had this healthy view of ourselves. So to illustrate this point, I'd like to share a bit of my story and how I got here. So this slide is just some aspects or the contours of my life, if you will. My parents immigrated from South Korea to the U.S. in 1980. I was born in 84 in a very small town in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, called Rochelle, Illinois. I moved to Atlanta, or our family moved to Atlanta when I was 4 years old, where my dad finished grad school at Georgia Tech. I have one younger brother. We're 10 years apart. So for the first 10 years of my life, I grew up as an only child and got used to life that way very much. As I mentioned before, I grew up in the Korean Presbyterian Church, and this institution was very formative to me growing up. I am married to my wife, Eileen, and we have two wonderful children who are 9 and 5, respectively. And you can see some of my hobbies there. I'm really into coffee, and I'm into this genre of music called minimalist funk. I can tell you more about that later. I love all kinds of sports that have a ball included, and I love to read. I'm always sort of head in a book for my free time, and it's a habit that I picked up more during the pandemic, and it stuck with me. And if there's anything good from the pandemic that happened in my life, it's that I fell back in love with reading. I mentioned I love coffee, and this is sort of my PSA slide for coffee. I'll just be real quick with it. Some people call me a coffee snob. Um, I just call it, I like to respect my taste buds when it comes to coffee. I'm not so much of a foodie, but when it comes to coffee, I don't know. I just got really into it because I drank a lot of it in my studies during medical school and residency. But here's my PSA. So if you want to, if you're into coffee, um, respect for your taste buds includes you got to get a burr grinder, not a blade grinder. Don't buy your beans already ground where they're all soft in the bag. You want beans. You need a scale, and any scale will do. It's $15, $10 from Amazon. Ideally, you have a SCAA certified coffee maker. SCAA stands for Specialty Coffee Association of America. That is a website, and they certify coffee makers that make a pour over quality cup of coffee. You want some decent coffee that is batch roasted. So, I'm not knocking on Starbucks or Seattle's Best, but those are not batch roasted. Those are mass roasted, if you will. Um, and then you want a vacuum sealed container that is kept at room temperature. Coffee does not belong in the freezer or the fridge. So, and then you just need some math, a 17-to-1 ratio. You calculate however many cups of coffee you want in milliliters. You divide that number by 17, and then you can weigh out your grams. And that's it. That's all you got to do. So, if this appeals to you, please come talk to me later. I'm happy to set you up in your coffee game. Okay. Anyway, that aside, I mentioned earlier, I grew up in the Korean American Presbyterian Church. These are actual photos from the church I grew up at in KCPC Atlanta, Korean Community Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. And I'm one of those kids whose dad was an elder and my mom sang in the choir. And so church was a big part of my life growing up. This was a place where I learned to love Jesus, where I grew in faith. This was the place where I felt a sense of belonging as a as a child and adolescent, a sense of community. This was a place that taught me values and showed me what made life meaningful. I served on the worship team. I went on numerous short term mission trips. I led Bible studies in small groups. And looking back, it's easy to say that my entire identity really was wrapped up in having a sort of zealous passion for Jesus. I used to joke like Dietrich Bonhoeffer was my hero. Like he was the person that I wanted to become when I was older. So, if I were to come up with a list of values that were most formative for me growing up, it would be the things I've listed here. Things like commitment and self sacrifice, the centrality of scripture, being mission driven, not conforming to the world, um, maintaining a posture of humility, this idea of less of me and more of Jesus, and then really valuing a sense of belonging and community that I experienced uh, personally growing up in the church. Now, at face value, all of these are, I think, really powerful concepts. And for a kid like me who didn't get a lot of this kind of teaching at home, I ate it up at church. And so, because the church became my source of not just faith or learning about Jesus, but it became my source of morals and values, it also became the community whose opinions I cared about the most. And if I'm honest, there were times, not just a few times, there were many times when what the pastor would say carried more weight than what my family would say. So if we fast forward a few years, during medical school, I met Eileen and we got married in May of 2011. And then the day after we came back from our honeymoon, we moved to Chicago where I started my residency. And here you can see a photo, in this photo, a picture of Rush Medical Center where I did my training. And one of our top priorities was when we moved to Chicago, was to get plugged into a church and commit. And so within a few weeks of moving to Chicago, we joined a small Asian American church plant that was founded on the verse on Micah 6:8, which says, "He has shown you, O man or O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Eileen and I were instantly drawn to this church because of its missional focus on justice and reconciliation, primarily within the city limits of Chicago. This church was a gospel-centered community that wanted to do good work in the city. And so we threw ourselves into this church community. We got involved as much as we could. We served on leadership. We showed up to every event. We even attended marches and community meetings. We moved to the west side of Chicago to live incarnationally with people whom we were trying to serve. And there was a point in time in which we were so proud to be a part of this church because it was trying to do something meaningful in the community. And yet, after 6 or 7 years, it all fell apart. And it honestly was quite devastating. So what happened? Well, there are a lot of reasons that I could cite. There definitely was a component of financial strain and a lack of numbers. But if I had to boil it down to one thing, it was that we were completely about the mission, completely outwardly focused, without any regard for our internal well-being. It was like we were religious hustle culture on 100, right? Self-sacrifice, for example, that was seen as a badge of honor. That we talked about this idea of privilege ad nauseum, and to the extent that it was weaponized to make each other feel guilty about how we were raised and how we spent money. And I remember how I had this conversation with a community member who wasn't a part of our church, but was starting to get involved, who asked me, "Man, why are you guys so hard on yourselves?" And I had no good answer. And perhaps worst of all, um, in addition to that, in the church, there was this utter absence of grace. And in fact, in the entire existence of the church, at least from when Eileen and I joined, no one could remember if there was ever a sermon that was preached on grace. Because to talk about grace was seen as permission to be insular or inwardly focused. And so, as you can probably imagine, there wasn't a lot of joy in this community. But still, we felt like, or we thought that we were doing the important work of God and that it was, in a way, it was supposed to hurt. And ultimately, as the church continued to go downhill, as we were spiraling, so did the church community. And Eileen and I, we lost friendships. And these are people we had gotten to know so well. We felt like failures, letting the people we had met in the west side of Chicago down. And after the church shut its doors, there were many people, many members who left the church, the institution of the church altogether. And to this day, most have not rejoined a community. And what grieves me the most as a former leader of this community was that I myself promoted a lot of the toxicity in the culture. All of the issues that I just mentioned, I had a hand in promoting. Of course, it was not intentional, and I always thought what I was doing was right, but and of course that was at the time, and now I can look back and realize some of the mistakes that I had made. But still, I think it's important for me to say that I share responsibility for what had happened. This whole value system that I had thought shaped my identity actually became more and more distorted as I buckled harder and harder to serve the church. And so this is where the underside or the underbelly of these values came out. Commitment, self-sacrifice actually became distorted into believing that my emotions are not to be trusted. The real Christians persevere. Faith equals suffering. The centrality of scripture became this distorted message of gaining knowledge about the Bible solves every problem in my life. Being mission driven, not conforming to the world, became this distorted message of self-righteousness, an arrogant kind of certainty, having or holding judgment against others. This idea of humility and this concept of less of me, more of Jesus became this message that I told myself of having no regard or very, very little regard for myself, living in a perpetual self-denial state, and believing that caring for myself is a selfish act. Belonging in community was a message distorted in the sense that I realized or I learned that it was conditional and it was predicated on presenting yourself in the right way. A while back, I read this book called My Beautiful Idol, and it became one of those books that left a very strong impression on me. And the book talks about this little sea creature here called the decorator crab. And what this crab does is that it crawls along the ocean floor and it finds things like rocks and old shells and even sea anemone to attach to its own shell so that it can stay camouflaged from its natural predator, like squids and bigger fish. And so the idea is by disguising itself and hiding its true nature and appearance, the crab feels safe to explore the ocean floor and find food. It literally cannot feel safe without things on its shell. And so the analogy is that we are like this decorator crab. Throughout our lives, we desperately seek to attach things to our shells, or AKA identity, that make us feel more loved, more valuable, important, worthy, and ultimately safe. The squids in our lives, the predators we fear, are things like shame, being unlovable, unworthiness, being found out as a fraud, loneliness, and We will fix anything to our shells that disguise us from the squids. A lot of the time, what the book says is we even think God is a squid who's out to get us. And for me, my crab shell was about two things: one, external achievement, and two, being known as a devoted, committed believer who was sold out for Jesus. And one quote from this book has always stayed with me. It says that as long as we remain uneaten, it feels like it's working. And this was absolutely the case for me. The thing is, with all this stuff on our shells, which means our true selves stay hidden from view, we're never fully seen or known. Our value is always based on what we show externally. And so we never truly feel safe. And I think that this is one way to think about idolatry. It's sort of this decision or this choice to live in this false self, depending on the things we fix or affix to ourselves, our identities that make us feel more important or worthy, that work in place of what God says about who we are. With time and reflection, I can see how Kurt Thompson, he wrote this book called Anatomy of the Soul, has very poignantly said that I was all about outward success, but was inwardly defeated. My baseline was to be in denial about this internal external divorce. And the thing about outward success is that it works to fill our cups until one day it doesn't. And in the fallout, for me at least, I saw how unstable the ground I had been standing on really was. My identity was my shell, false self, and the best it could bring was temporary success. And there was this terrifying moment when I realized that I was living by a value system that had gotten completely distorted because I had no real sense of who I was. And it wasn't until later on when I learned about some really important, life changing things that I'm going to share with you all that I realized that this crash that I experienced was actually an inevitability. I had spent my entire life up until that point building up this beautiful crab shell to tell the world that Stan Sonu is one of the real Christians and he's a good guy, he's a virtuous guy. And it was to prove my worth and my value to God, to my friends, to my family. And the really distorted part about all this is even when I had the knowledge in my head of God's unconditional love for me, my body still acted like I needed to earn it. So let me skip ahead here for the sake of time and jump to part two. So when we finally left our church, Eileen and I, we were both quite disillusioned. We had lost the community. We had poured every part of ourselves into this church, and we exhausted ourselves doing so. We had, and at the end of the day, we had nothing to show for it. What's interesting, though, is that neither of us blamed God for any of these failures. Instinctively, we knew that the failures were actually human. And around this time, I completed my residency and I was doing my fellowship in public health. And this was when I learned about the most important topic that I had never learned about in medical school. And it was about trauma and its effects on our well being, our health, and even our identity. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized, or not only did I realize how much the church had actually missed this story, but in many ways, the way the church was operating was in fact perhaps exacerbating the problem. So quickly, I just want to share that it started with this groundbreaking landmark public health study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences or ACE study. And maybe perhaps some of you have heard about it here, but the reason I found this study so impactful was because it demonstrated in a very large scale population level research model that number one, childhood adversities are actually common. They're more common than they are not in the average person. And secondly, oftentimes the difficult things that we experience in childhood whether it's abuse or neglect or stress in the home, the times when we are scared or we're alone and there was no one to help us, or to understand these things, these experiences aren't just difficult or painful memories or stories from our past, but the effects of them are deeper and they're bigger, and they can actually lead to changes in our physiology, changes in the way our brains develop in childhood, and they can contribute and result in a whole host of poor outcomes. So the kinds of adversities that they asked about are shown here. Basically, there's 10 of them total. They span three domains of abuse, neglect, and household stress. They asked about physical, emotional, and sexual abuse. They asked about physical or emotional neglect. And then they asked about different stressors that a child could experience in the home, such as a parent or a caregiver with a mental health problem or a substance use problem, intimate partner violence against the mother, an incarcerated relative, and then parental separation and divorce. Now, a few months back at my own church in Atlanta, we actually held a mental health seminar, and in the seminar, I there were about 61 people who attended, and I invited people anonymously to complete an ACE questionnaire. I just wanted to get a sense of how common are these events in the church community that I'm a part of. Now, this church that I attend, I love this community. It's healing in so many ways, but socioeconomically, we are upper middle class, predominantly East Asian. This is not a church where you would necessarily expect there to be a high prevalence of these experiences. And so when I looked at the data, I was shocked. 80% of our members had one ACE or more. About 45% had three ACEs or more, and 30% had four ACEs or more. Those numbers are much larger than what was recorded or reported in the initial ACE study. We had no idea how common these events were in our community. And there were people who had been attending the church for a long period. They were shocked as well because uh, they had no idea that so many people in our church had suffered so much in their childhood, and there hadn't ever been a place to work through those things in our community. So as you can imagine, that generated a lot of good discussion among our church members. I just wanted to show some the breadth of outcomes that were found to be linked with the ACE study, um, to just give you a sense of the gravity of this problem and how truly widespread it is. So ACEs are associated with health risk behavior, things like smoking cigarettes, alcoholism, illicit drug use. They're certainly associated with mental health problems like depression, anxiety, PTSD, a history of suicide attempts. What had my jaw on the ground was this link between ACEs and chronic diseases, things that I see very commonly in my clinic on the adult side: heart disease, stroke, lung disease, cancer, diabetes. And then ACEs affect how we function socially. So um, they impact our financial well-being. They're associated with unemployment or other kinds of delinquency. And so, what the broad consensus of research has shown over the last 3 decades is that trauma, whether it's experienced on an interpersonal level or at a community or societal level, like racism or poverty or violence in the community, or a historical level, like fleeing from a war-torn land, at any level, trauma has profound effects across the life course, across several domains. Trauma leads to lower thresholds for dysregulation, social dysfunction, disease, disability, and early death. And the thing about it is now, this research isn't going anywhere. And it really is on those institutions, those sectors in our society that interface with humans, not just healthcare, but education, the justice system, and the faith community, to grapple with this research. It's not going anywhere. I mean, it's just been replicated and seen in so many different localities. It's been seen in every single country that's done this work, in every kind of population. And so this research, because it's not going anywhere, leaves us to ask the question, like, what are we going to do about it? If we take a step back and think about this, what becomes clear, what I hope becomes clear, is that the experience of trauma for a lot of people, especially in our faith communities, is not just an experience or just a part of someone's past. On the contrary, the experience of trauma can be devastating across multiple domains of well-being and functioning. There's a backstory to the dysfunction that exists in our lives. And I had experienced a lot of dysfunction, but never knew it was something that I needed to address. I was outwardly successful, but inwardly defeated. And the thing is, without awareness, we human beings, especially children, we don't question the circumstances. We just go ahead and adapt. And I love this quote from Resmaa Menakem. He's a trauma therapist who wrote a wonderful book called My Grandmother's Hands. He says that trauma in a person decontextualized over time looks like personality. Trauma in a family decontextualized over time looks like family traits. Trauma in a people decontextualized over time looks like culture. And this is an apt way to describe the way that trauma creates distortions in the way we know ourselves, our families, and society. And it speaks to how our society, and I would add churches, have so normalized the dysfunction stemming from trauma that it looks like culture. Trauma in a church, decontextualized over time, looks like blind obedience. Another important concept that I want to highlight here is the cyclical nature of intergenerational trauma, which can be defined as this cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that's transmitted from one generation to the next in the absence of direct exposure. It's when trauma experienced by one generation affects the health and well-being of the next, their children. And sometimes the painful reality is that this means that certain types of trauma are passed on. For example, physical abuse or alcohol use. But more often, what's passed on are the effects of trauma on the parent to the next generation. And because this is still largely unknown or unacknowledged, or even actively suppressed, not just within our families, but within our faith communities, the cycle continues. So here's one way to look at it. Here we have three generations, and if you start at the top, at the grandparents' generation, experiences of war and famine and extreme poverty and racism among the grandparents' generation when they were children may have led to experiences of neglect and abuse and silence and denial, addiction, abandonment in that next generation. And then in the current children's generation, they're experiencing depression, anxiety, imposter syndrome, burnout, addiction, consumerism. And so you can see how these sort of initial traumas that were experienced generations ago, the effects of those can still trickle down, even though the grandchildren's generation were not directly exposed to those initially traumatic events. And in the Asian American faith community, I would say that there's so much intergenerational stuff we have yet to unpack and make sense of that for the most part has been shrouded in silence or denial. And you know what? Some people say it's a luxury that we can even talk about trauma. And I would actually I would push back against that and ask, really, is it easy to heal from the most painful things that have occurred to our families? Or is it easier to stay silent and to keep your head down and just carry on? Which one is actually easier? In fact, it's no luxury at all that we have an opportunity to talk about trauma. I would say that it's a responsibility. and it's a difficult responsibility to bear. Now, since learning about trauma, I know I'm coming up on time, but I did want to highlight some more dynamics specific to Asian Americans. One thing I've thought a lot about is what Asian American collective traumas might be and how we've been shaped by these experiences. And I remember during the pandemic, I read this quote in the New York Times by Stephen Yun, the actor, and he was talking, I think he was interviewed by J. Caspian King, and he said that, sometimes I wonder if the Asian American experience is what it's like when you're thinking about everyone else, but nobody else is thinking about you. I was shocked when I read this quote because I was like, I've felt this my entire life, and here he is just naming it so poignantly. What's fascinating to me is that this idea of invisibility, which describes part of our experience as Asian Americans, has this connection to trauma and specifically neglect. So if you take a look at some of the definitions of neglect and invisibility here, there's clearly this continuum of neglect that includes a sense of invisibility. And I think this is important because, and I want to say this very clearly, the experience of invisibility is not benign because it's a form of neglect. And neglect is definitely not benign. And in fact, among researchers who study trauma and the effects of trauma, neglect is understood as one of the worst kinds of trauma in childhood. And so I was asking this question, well, is emotional neglect then something that is like a shared experience among AAPIs, whether you're South Asian or East Asian? And on a societal level, what I sort of parsed out was, yes, we've actually been, we've experienced invisibility as a people group. We don't fit within this white-black binary in terms of discussions of race. There's a general lack of familiarity in the mainstream with double API values. And then all the time, many of us have encountered these sort of monolithic, reductive stereotypes, whether it's the model minority stereotype or being a perpetual foreigner. The main message here is that AAPIs just aren't worth getting to know or are all the same. But this experience of invisibility is not only limited to a societal or cultural space. There are other levels in our experience, for example, on a familial or interpersonal level, in which invisibility or neglect happened or is still happening. So things like cultural norms in our families on acknowledging the reality of mental health or mental health problems. The systemic issue of language barriers. So if as a child, my primary language is English and I'm understanding complex topics in English, but my parents they speak Korean or they speak Mandarin, and I cannot communicate to them those sort of abstract or complex topics, that is not that is not necessarily neglect of ill intent, but it is at the end of the day still a version of neglect because that child is left not being understood because of a language barrier. And then there are other socio-cultural barriers that get in the way of a child sort of being understood, their experience, their worldview and experiences being understood. And then there are spiritual slash religious examples of neglect, such as spiritual bypassing with this sort of focus or emphasis on behavior modification, this conflation of selfishness with biblical self-love. So we can't even talk about ourselves without feeling like we're being selfish or too self-absorbed or in sort of displacing, what or who we should think or how we should think about ourselves in God's eyes. And then I mentioned before, we sort of have this really difficult relationship with emotions to the extent that I've heard from the pulpit my entire life that emotions are not to be trusted, but rather feared or disregarded or abandoned. And so if you put all these together, no wonder it's so hard for Asian Americans for us to grapple with our mental health and have a healthy view of ourselves. The difficult thing about neglect, though, is that part of the coping or survival response is to bury, hide, or erase the experience of neglect altogether. It turns out that the most terrifying experience for a child is not physical pain or even emotional abuse. The most terrifying experience is the feeling that they are alone because they are unworthy of affection or care. And this is an unbearable situation for children, and most will adapt with the creation of alternative narratives. So, for many of us who are Asian American, who are second gen, we had parents who worked endlessly for the family, and we were keenly aware of their daily sacrifice. And many of us felt a lot of appreciation and respect for this. At the same time, it made it impossible to say anything, to express a need that we had. So what did most of us do? We ate it. We stayed silent. Whatever emotional pain or need we had, we squashed it. And we justified squashing it by saying my parents did the best they could, which made it okay to minimize our needs. We have this tendency, I think, in the faith community is implicated to just think in binaries, black and white. And I think that can actually cause harm. And this is a good example of that. A lot of us have difficulty acknowledging parts of our past, parts of our, our stories, because it feels like we're betraying the people we love so dearly. And I just wanted to say, I want to, create space to say we can hold two truths here. That on the one hand, our parents did do the best they could, and they sacrificed so much for us and are worthy of love and respect endlessly for that. At the same time, there were times when, as children, we didn't get what we needed. Both of these things can be true, and it is not a betrayal of our parents to acknowledge both truths. I got a couple more slides, Pastor Jen, if that's okay, and then I might have to stop there and then come back next month. Um, but just to wrap this section up, to get a little bit more granular, there have been studies that have shown that experiences of neglect can have a more severe impact than abuse. And the figures here are from a study in which children who were about 3.5 years old, who experienced different kinds of maltreatment um, in their early childhood period, took these assessments that looked at creativity and confidence and assertiveness. And what you can appreciate is that neglected children showed the lowest levels of creativity, confidence, and assertiveness. I don't think that we as Asian Americans are quiet, we're meek, we're passive. I actually would push back against that stereotype very strongly. The loudest times during a church service are not actually during the service, but it's actually when the service ends, right? And now you hear, as soon as the benediction closes, the room erupts in conversation. But yet, we deal with these stereotypes that we're not sort of participatory, we're not vocal. I think there's something going on with how we are how we sort of normalize this culture of our behavior, and I wonder if neglect has something to do with it. Okay, this is my last slide here. So I just wanted to highlight some behaviors and emotional indicators of neglect, because I realize that even as I'm talking about this, we need to ground this idea of neglect to more concrete behaviors to have relevancy in our lives. These are not behaviors that are necessarily unique to neglect, but I think they're still useful to think through because there is an underlying rationale for each of these that relate to how a person copes or covers the wound of neglect. So the first one is difficulty accessing emotions, or downplaying them or making light of them. This is when a person has trouble getting into that emotional space, and instead they try to stay up here every second when they're awake. They're highly analytical or intellectual. And and the rationale here is that if emotions when they were a child were never seen, acknowledged, respected, or honored, if by expressing an emotional need, that child was ridiculed or punished, emotional suppression or repression is the adaptive mechanism. And so this is why a trait like toxic masculinity, for example, is connected actually to emotional neglect in childhood. Perfectionism. This is the big one for a lot of us in the church. Perfectionism is actually a chronic low grade stress response that is our attempt to control the terms of acceptance, validation, or love that wasn't there consistently growing up. And the idea here is that if the person is perfect, then there's never a reason for them not to be loved or appreciated or validated. It can also develop if a person only received validation or acceptance or attention or a sense of safety whenever they did something good. There's all kinds of relationship challenges that can go along with neglect because neglect emotionally so often leads to emotional suppression and fragmentation. That's why it can create all of these, dysfunctional relational patterns. So difficulty understanding or empathizing with our partner, difficulty hearing feedback or having distress or defensiveness when it comes to feedback. Obviously, that goes hand in hand with perfectionism. When that person with perfectionistic tendencies receives critique, it shatters that narrative of controllable love and acceptance, and it can send us into kind of a shame tailspin, and that sort of sends us into a self-protective mode. Self-sabotage, transactional quid pro quo relationships. Self-sabotage is a big one because the relationship might be going well, but the threat of the other person leaving fills the person with such intense fear and anxiety that they kind of torch the relationship first or do everything they can to make the other person dislike them. It's sort of actualizing a self-fulfilling prophecy or narrative. There's a revolving door of guilt and shame and self-absorption. The feeling of being unlovable or unworthy makes us tethered to family expectations, but at the same time, we resent those expectations. We feel duty bound to our families, but then feel resentful and go into periods of extreme self-absorption, which send us into a sort of shame tailspin itself. Low self-esteem, having a default self-critical view. I think that might be the most self-explanatory one. And having people-pleasing behavior or an inability to depend on others or ask for support. So in response to neglect, some people can swing in the direction of, well, if I'm just the nicest, or if I'm the most capable, if I'm the most put together, if I'm the most friendly person you've ever met, um, I'll always be okay in your eyes. I won't feel worthy, unworthy, or unlovable. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. I do have this section, or I mean, I can keep going. Um, I'll leave it up to you all here if you have time, but about 15 more minutes of kind of what we can do or how we can sort of interface with our communities with this information.
Well, I'll leave it up to the group democracy here. I would like to stop so that we can process the amount of things that Stan has given, but also this allows me to see Stan again and let him lead another one. But gentlemen, Ed, David, Jerry, you guys want to go a little bit longer, or do you want to just process right now? I lean on processing because he just unloaded like a whirlwind of
I know it's a
fire
lot.
hydrant
Yeah.
of information. You guys let me know. Ed, Dave, Jerry, you guys are here, so we want to make the best of time. I think I'm leaning on process, but if you guys want the next stage, which is how to integrate what he's just shared into our work, that's concrete, and you probably want, I want that now so I can apply it this week at my church. You guys let me know, guys.
Well, personally, Jen, I wouldn't mind if we kept going. Some of the stuff that is being shared, I really appreciate your presentation. Is things that I'm actually dealing with right now because I'm speaking at a revival here in Oklahoma. And so this will really help me to help those that are in my sphere right now.
Thank you, Pastor Dave. Ed, Jerry, what do you think? Should we just press on, or should we take a little
I
break
would
and just
like to
process?
press on. I don't
We're
want to
like,
wait
press on. All
till the
right,
next
resilience.
next month,
See
but I
here.
just want
Ed?
one comment. I really
Yes, Jerry.
appreciate how you contextualize the emotional neglect, that how it can manifest in so many behavior, attitudes, way of relating, and very refreshing for me. So I really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thank you. Great to hear.
Yeah.
Thank you for the affirmation. Oh, go ahead.
Ed, we want to press on, buddy, or should we? Go
Sure.
ahead.
I just have a hard stop at 1:15, but I'm good. I'm good to go.
Okay. All right,
All
Stan,
right.
it seems like we want to go on, so let's.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm excited too, because I didn't want to leave us on this foot where there's like bad news, right? I've shared a lot of, as Pastor Jin said, heavy information, and I know it can feel like a lot. And I've had people mention to me like I'm still processing all this weeks later. Um, and I think that's part of just the nature of having a limited amount of time to share a lot of information that this is 8-9 years of processing for me in a 1 hour slide deck. So totally understandable, but I'm glad we can spend some time thinking about the so what question. Like how can we come out of this especially in our faith communities. So, just to recap, in part one, I shared a bit about my story, experience in the church, and how, despite wanting to apply all the things that I had learned in the church, things fell apart because I had no real sense of what it meant to actually love myself in the way that God loves me. I knew it up here, but it wasn't an embodied experience. And instead of being known by God, I showed him a crab shell version of myself as if that would convince him. And then in part two, what we just talked about, that was really unpacking the backstory of why we end up having this compulsion to hide behind our self-made idols or crab shells. These experiences of trauma, whether they're experienced interpersonally, whether they're experienced intergenerationally or collectively as double APIs, these experiences result in reactive adaptations and fragmentation of ourselves that perpetuate dysfunction and harm. So, what can a faith community do in response? How can we heal? Well, this is, not necessarily like a linear process, but these are some of the things that I would suggest that we consider. And I'll go through each one of these in a second. But just to read them off, first, we have to, I think, take ownership of this idea of self-regulation. And to do this requires growing our own sense of self-awareness, which I'll talk more about in a second. Secondly, and I don't think even professional religious experts or religious professionals like pastors are necessarily immune from growing distant from God or going through the sort of rote patterns of ministry. And so I think there needs to be sort of a return to being known by God in a very real way. Third, we need to show up for our community, and that's promoting this phrase of safe, stable, nurturing relationships, the kind of dynamic in a relationship that is the most healing, it is the most developmentally optimal. There's so many benefits with the relationship that is described as safe, stable, and nurturing. Fourth, we just have to get real with ourselves and get help when it's needed. And that takes a lot of courage. I understand that. But it has to be said. And again, I don't think pastors or people in the faith community are necessarily immune from addiction. Fifth, there's some aspects from this body of work called systems theory that can actually help us think about what does it mean to flourish, and what do flourishing systems look like? And if we get to that point, that I think maybe that's a little bit more abstract for this group, but I'll cover the first four in detail in that fifth one if we have time. So first, this idea of taking ownership of our own self-regulation. I don't have time to necessarily expand in great detail on this today, but there's a lot we have learned about the ways in which trauma, these experiences of trauma, affect our brain development and brain function. I do want to share a little bit about this because I think knowing about what's happening in the brain and our nervous systems can actually go a long way to empower us towards meaningful change. So let me expound on this topic of stress for a minute. Now, before modern civilization, when we were living in, clans or hunter-gatherer groups or little villages, our bodies needed a fast-acting, efficient stress response system for survival. So for example, if we were all, in a clan and we came across this animal in the woods, instantly we would recognize this is a potential life-threatening situation, and we would need our bodies to kick it into high gear to survive this life-threatening event. So inside of our bodies, these responses would occur. Our stress response system, upon getting that information from our eyes, would activate, and the stress response system activates these two separate systems called the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. And these systems are activated before a conscious thought even enters our mind. It's like when you're driving down the highway and someone cuts you off all of a sudden, and you swerve or you brake. All that happens before you even realize or can verbalize what's happening. And so the experience of threat or fear has clear effects on our biology. Again, these are all changes that are occurring inside the body. So as the sympathetic nervous system and as the HPA axis activates, there's a flood of hormones that get released in our body, and they go to our various organs, like our muscle groups, our lungs, our eyes, and have all of these predictable functions. But what you might see in another person, your neighbor, your spouse, your friend, the output or the action of that stress response can actually be quite variable. So some people might try to fight the bear. Some people might try to run away from the bear. And if you can't fight and you can't run, very often what children will do is they will stay put and they will freeze or dissociate. So again, inside of our bodies, the same thing is going on, but the output of that stress response system really depends on what has worked in the past. Now, when the brain has encountered repeated adversities and traumas, it learns quickly. And so some of the responses can actually become patterned and thus predictable as traumatic stress responses. So the fight response can pathologically become a hypervigilant response, a sort of sense of heightened awareness to any potential or perceived threat. And this could look like someone who, blows up because their flight is delayed at the ticketing person, at the gate, at something at a minor trigger, or someone who becomes really anxious and impatient and starts to yell or argue and blame. And I would say that during our time in Chicago, I had a persistent low-grade hypervigilance. I was constantly on guard, and it made me unpleasant to be around. The flight response can turn into avoidance or denial, trying to change the subject or not wanting to talk about it. I had a patient one time, I'm telling her some really serious information about her child. And in the middle of our conversation, she pulls out a phone and starts playing music. Initially, I thought that was so rude, what was going on. But then I remembered, actually, it was at a point in our conversation when I was telling her what the diagnosis was. And I realized that actually this could represent her flight response taken over in order for her to restore a sense of safety. The third response, freeze, again, which is often what children have to do, can become various dissociative responses. Um, again, this is the reason this is the third best response is because, especially in children, is when they can't, if the source of their trauma or fear is in the home, and they can't fight and win or run away and survive, then they will do the third best thing in freeze in place and dissociate. It's also very common in adulthood because most of us haven't realized that this is the one way um, this is the one way we cope. The behavior is left alone, and there are so many socially acceptable ways today to dissociate, such as workaholism, substance use, gambling, Netflix, even foodie culture or travel culture. These seem like innocuous things on the surface, but a lot of times, if we're not sort of careful, they may actually represent ways to escape and ways to not deal with problems or stress that we're encountering. There's a fourth response, and that's the fawn response, which can become a distortion into this accommodating pattern. This is a subconscious behavioral strategy that a child or adult might use to mitigate anticipated harm or anticipated distress. And the idea is that by being accommodating, which often means the phrase, walking on eggshells, by being accommodating to the source of stress, the individual can actually avoid or minimize the threat. And this can be problematic because it can appear as if a person is laid back, doesn't care, or goes with the flow, or is just loyal to even their abuser. And I include this response here because this was also one of the dynamics at play in our church in Chicago. None of us wanted to defy the pastor, even when we felt conflicted about what he was saying or doing. And our complicity wasn't because we lacked moral fortitude. It was because we were in survival mode. And so the bottom line here is that when our stress response system is asked to do much more than it was designed for, in the absence of buffering resources, it can predictably lead to pathology and fragmentation and these kinds of stress responses. So in order to make sure that we're not sort of erupting into these responses, we have to have a sense of self-regulation. And so the way we can increase the likelihood of staying out of those states is self-regulation. And this is one of my favorite illustrations of self-regulation by this physician named Dan Siegel. He's a thought leader in this field called interpersonal neurobiology. And he uses this illustration called the river of integration. So when we're regulated, when we're feeling well, when we're at baseline, we can flow down this river of integration and handle challenges throughout the day as our best selves. We're flexible, we're adaptive, we're coherent, meaning that we've made sense of our lives, we're free from the prisons of our past, we feel energized and stable. And when we become disintegrated, we can either get stuck on the bank of chaos, which looks like, hypervigilance, anxiety, rage, irritability, or we can get stuck on the bank of rigidity. And that looks like a depressive state, disconnection or wanting to disconnect, exhaustion, numbing, a feeling of being burned out. So the goal here is not to, it's not to spend time trying to avoid hitting one bank or the other. That's actually impossible. Life is going to happen. And sometimes we're going to be dealing with so much that we can't but help get stuck on one of those banks. But the goal rather is to increase the width of the river or increase the space between the riverbanks so that we have more capacity to remain integrated. Like I said, we can't avoid challenging situations altogether. It's just not realistic. There's going to be times when we will become dysregulated. But what we can do is take intentional steps to widen the space between the riverbanks. So one question for reflection that I'll offer here is, we need to ask ourselves, what are those scenarios or contexts or interactions that shift me to a state of chaos or shift me to a state of rigidity. And this is where that self-awareness practice comes into play, because the more we know ourselves, the more we know the things that trigger us, so to speak, or lower our threshold to get stuck on a bank, the better we can sort of prepare for those, or go get help for those things, or pray about those things specifically, that God would help free us from the bondage of those very things that trap us on those banks. So, um, I think another question that is useful to ask is, what helps to widen my zone of regulation? And what I love about this is that oftentimes it's different for everyone, right? For me, what widens my zone is good coffee, or a good book, a quiet and peaceful place to read. It's talking to my wife about the day after the kids go down. Okay. Secondly, open up this. The second practice I would offer is to open ourselves up to being known by God. And I know that sounds quite simple, but I actually think that this is, life's work, really. The idea of allowing ourselves to be known captures one of the, I would argue, major dilemmas in the Asian American church today. We are so obsessed with theological rigor. When our people struggle, when we sense that there's some unaddressed issue or sin, we double down on knowledge transfer. We think we can think our way out of the darkness. We say to ourselves, if only I could just know more, then things would be fixed or better. But I would submit that the deeper reason we do this is because even attaining knowledge or falling back on theological certainties is itself a coping mechanism. More knowledge only leaves fragmentation left unaddressed. And so let me share some lines that really illustrate the importance of being known. First one comes from Scripture, 1 Corinthians in chapter 8. Knowledge puffs up while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not yet know as they ought to know. But whoever loves God is known by God. And this next quote is even more direct. We tend to place a great deal of emphasis on the ways and the degree to which we know God or know things about God, rather than to the degree we are being known by God. And that's from Kurt Thompson. There's another quote from Kurt Thompson. You cannot know God if you do not experience being known by him. The degree to which you know God is directly reflected in your experience of being known by him. And the degree that you are known by him will be reflected in the way in which you are known by other people. In other words, your relationship with God is a direct reflection of the depth of your relationship with others. When we learn what it's like to be known by those in our lives, we open ourselves to being known and loved by God. Again, when we learn what it's like to be known by those in our lives, we open ourselves up to being known and loved by God. I think that's a beautiful truth and reminder. And honestly, this is something that I cannot say in secular spaces. This is what is missing in the secular conversation when it comes to trauma. There's no sort of basis for this idea of being known by God or a higher power. And that's why I think so much of our response to what we learn about trauma has to be grounded in a faith community context. Third, we can embody what a restored or healthy relationships look like. And this raises this idea of promoting safe, stable, and nurturing connections with our church members and our children. I wish I could spend more time on developmental neurobiology, but I think the most important thing to know is that God designed our brains specifically to thrive in the setting of healthy connection. We're born with a social connection, attunement shaped, lock in our lives. And when that is unlocked with healthy relationships, it optimizes brain development. Social connection is important for health, not just in childhood, but really across the entire life course. And I love this quote from Bruce Perry. He's a leader in treating trauma in children. He says that the human brain is neurobiologically designed for relationships, but we humans have invented contexts that are relationally impoverished. In our modern society, it's actually becoming harder and harder for our children to grow up in relationally rich environments. There's just more familial isolation, community isolation, etc. So I bring up the importance of relationships in community to say that it is not a given. Far from it. Isolation and disconnection, rather, are becoming the given or becoming the norm. We have to actively think about ways to be a countercurrent in a world that says we're better off spending times on our devices, we're better off spending eating meals alone, this and that and the other. As far as what sort of healthy relationships can look like, or the contours of healthy relationships, one of the most important things that I share with parents of young children in my pediatrics clinic is the power, the irreplaceable power of safe, stable, nurturing relationships to promote the healthiest trajectory of brain development. Safe, stable, nurturing relationships are not just for children, they're also important for adults. They're important to the life and the health of a community as well. In fact, the very thing people who've experienced trauma, the very thing they need is a safe community defined by safety, stability, and nurturing connection. We need healthy social connection to heal, and that is God's design. And it's the science, really, that I would argue is catching up to God's truth about this. One challenging truth that I think this is hard for a lot of parents to hear, but can serve as kind of a wake-up call, is that children don't experience what a parent feels towards them. They experience who the parent is. And I just offer this here as well because I know that many of us work with parents in our faith communities, and this is an issue that comes up a lot. How can I best serve, or how can I be a parent who's known and knows my child or children well. Okay, fourth, getting professional help when it is needed. This certainly includes counseling and therapy, but I also want to extend this point further and acknowledge that pastors are not invincible or immune to addictions of all kinds. And I think it's important here in a trauma-informed lens to reframe how we approach addiction or how we understand it. It is all the research and even my personal experience helping patients with various addictions. It's not about willpower. It's about self-medication. And the question is never why the addiction, but why the pain. Um, Addiction here is not just about substances, right? But it's also about work, spending money, exercise, any activity that a person engages in which there's a dependence on that activity or substance, or there's poor control in terms of when it's engaged, or when we're doing those activities, or there's risky use, is considered an addiction. And because addiction is a way for a person to kind of self-engineer a flood of dopamine and serotonin to self-medicate their pain, that's why we can actually also call it maladaptive coping. But really, the triad of any addiction is going to include, you have a susceptible individual, a person who has experienced trauma or ACEs and hasn't gotten help for it. There is some sort of access to an addictive substance or behavior. Again, anything that predictably leads to a release of dopamine and serotonin. These are the hormones in our brain that help us to feel good or at peace or alive. And then there's current stress. There's a need to cope. Again, I just put this here because I just want to stress that I think sometimes in our faith communities, the way we approach addiction is through this lens of sin. instead of this lens of pain. Now, addiction might be sin. I'm not disputing that as a theological fact, but what I'm sort of arguing or proposing here is that if we can approach it through a lens of someone who is hurting, someone who is in pain, I think we'll be more prepared and better able to meet that person where they are, help them understand where that source of pain is coming from, and actually have better success leading them or walking alongside them to meaningful change. Okay, I know I went longer than 15 minutes. I'm going to skip the flourishing integration part. I can come back for that, Pastor Jen, because that I can spend, I think, a whole hour just on that piece right there. I just want to end with this quote from Jacob Hamm, one of my most revered sources of information about trauma. He's a psychotherapist in New York. He says the opposite of trauma is not an absence of trauma. The opposite of trauma is presence. And to me, it's a beautiful image of when we are on this journey of healing, our eyes actually become more open and attuned to where God is moving in the places, in the spaces, in the people that are made beautiful in by God and in His image. So I think that this journey of healing from trauma is well worth it, and it is how we can get to a point of flourishing spiritually in a healthy way. I do have some books that I'll just leave up here. But yeah, happy to, take any questions or hear your comments and thoughts, and keep the conversation going.